Welcome to Missions Life, where we share resources and encouragement for current missionaries, future missionaries, and those praying for missionaries. Missions can be hard, and we want to help you face the challenges of life, leadership, and ministry. We want your life to bear fruit for the gospel wherever you are. I'm Kyle Ferran, here with my co-host and wife, Heather. Welcome to the Missions Life podcast. Today we have with us Alan Fadling, and he is the founding partner of Unhurried Living Incorporated in Orange County, California. He writes and speaks as an expert on the challenge of hurry in contemporary life and work and how to overcome it. He consults and coaches leaders and their organizations in the U.S. and around the world, helping them to work towards long-term productivity that lasts rather than settling for quick fixes that don't work. He's the award-winning author of 6 books, including An Unhurried Life, An Unhurried Leader, and A Non-Anxious Life. And today we're going to be talking with Alan about an unhurried life. And so, Alan, just thank you for being on with us. Welcome.
It's great to be able to have this time together. Thank you.
Well, just to kind of launch things off, where did the idea or a need for an unhurried life come from?
Well, the first line of the book goes like this. I'm a recovering speed addict. I'm not talking about about the drug. I'm talking about my soul. So in many ways, this book was and is an ongoing journey for me as a leader. I remember, for example, being in my 20s, a young leader, full-time working in a local church here in Southern California, full-time working on my degree at Fuller Seminary, and newly married. And sadly, probably my priorities were in about that order. And I began to burn out. I would come home from very long days, go to our guest room, turn off the light, and stare at the ceiling laying on the couch. That's not great pacing if you're burning out in your 20s. I'm in my 60s now. Thankfully, I've learned a couple of things. So I say all that to say it is a very personal thing. And then more recently, at least what led to writing the book, was just the awareness of how hurried our North American culture is. I say our, that's my culture. And how that hurry seeps into the way we think, even in ministry leadership settings.
Thank you. Yeah, it is, I think, a common experience of a lot of people. I know I experienced something similar as we got into missions, and a lot of people take that American mentality with them as they go overseas into missions. I remember one of the first things one of the South Africans told me when we first got to Richards Bay, South Africa. Now, this was partially because it was so hot there, but he's like, you go too fast. You need to slow down. He's like, you're going to die. And, but just that hurried pace. And even in Tanzania, where we were there, white people are called Mzungus, which literally means kind of spin around. And we as a culture are rather known for that hurried pace. And so just to be reminded of that is very helpful.
Well, what's really been interesting, if I could just piggyback, in my conversations with African leaders, I've had the joy of being in a number of different contexts there. One of the things I began to learn is, though hurry is not sort of an indigenous value in most of those communities, many of their leaders got trained in North American contexts, and they brought that hurry back with them. It was almost like a virus they didn't know they were catching. And so in some ways, sadly, with all the gifts that we give, I think, as a North American culture to the world, there are some things we pass along to the rest of the world we didn't mean to, and doesn't always help.
Yeah, definitely. We notice it when we come back from furlough. The pace that Americans live life is exhausting. Even though we're here in Europe, where it can be quite fast-paced, it's not quite the American pace. So that's something definitely to get on our radar, that first of all, as a culture, we really kind of celebrate this, and it's part of who we are. But you mentioned a quote in the book from John Ortberg that says, "Hurry is not just a disordered schedule. Hurry is a disordered heart." Can you unpack that quote a little bit for us and what the implications are there?
Yeah, That may sort of echo something I remember hearing Dallas Willard say more than once. He said, there's a difference between busy and hurried. Busy, that is your schedule. That's all the things that get crammed into your to-do list and into your appointment calendar. That busy is your schedule. Hurried is your soul.
Hmm.
Hmm.
Hurried is about who you are on the inside doing whatever it is you're doing. I can be hurried on a day off when I have no responsibilities at all. I can still be hurried because it's an inner orientation. And so when I talk about hurry or being unhurried, I'm not necessarily recommending do less stuff. What
Hmm.
I'm actually saying is learn to do what you do at a different sort of pace. I think the kingdom has a pace. I think it's the pace of love. It's the pace of peace. It's the pace of joy. And these are all unhurried ways of pacing our lives.
Hmm. Yeah, that's really helpful.
Yeah, when we get too much in a hurry, those other things you mentioned do seem to go out the window. Our love, our patience,
Yeah.
because our soul is hurried and we respond impatiently. One of the things you also talk
Yes.
about is how Jesus's ministry could be characterized by the word relaxed. I never
Hmm.
really thought about that way before, but it's so true. What can we learn about seeing Jesus in that way?
Yeah, that again comes from Dallas Willard in a conversation he once had with a good friend of mine, and he was saying, if you had only one word to describe Jesus, what word would you pick? And of course, there's a long list of very good candidates, titles, Lord, Savior, Messiah, whatever, or qualities like gentle, humble, loving, right? Lots of possibilities. And after a bit of a conversation, Dallas said, I think if I had just one word to describe Jesus, I would choose the word relaxed. And I remember the first time I heard that, part of me thought, wow, that's amazing. Another part of me thought, I don't think that's right. That sounds like Jesus isn't getting anything done. It sounds like Jesus doesn't care. I mean, what is Jesus sitting in a recliner watching sports TV? I mean, what do we mean here? Relax. That doesn't make any sense. And I remember at that time, I ended up going to a nearby retreat center for a few days. And all I did was with that sentence in mind about Jesus being relaxed is I read the gospels over and over and over. I wanted to see, does this ring true? Does this make sense? Is this a fair description of the way of Jesus? And I came to the conclusion that it's a genius description of Jesus. His the way he attracts little kids. Anxious, driven leaders do not draw little kids to themselves. It's like, get them out of here, kind of like the disciples did. I think Jesus is relaxed in the sense that he has time for the individual, even if he has a plan that he's working on. He's relaxed in the sense that there is space to be alone with the Father, even when the crowds are thrilled with what he's doing and just keep on coming. When there's amazing momentum, he's relaxed enough to say, yes, that still doesn't define me. Uh, the Father defines me, and I have time for the Father. I always have time for the Father. And so there's this posture in Jesus that I see in the Gospels. And I think relaxed is a really good word to label that.
That description was really helpful to me because when I'm looking to a leader to follow, I want them to be in control and relaxed with the situation. When I'm
Mm.
looking for someone that I know that I can reach out to that is, consistently going to be there for me. It's someone who has not a relaxed schedule, meaning they're not doing anything, but they have space for people. Like there's not a rush, rush, rush. It was a really good exercise, I think, just like you did when you went off to that retreat, to just really think on in what ways does the Bible describe Christ as relaxed? And it paints a beautiful picture.
I think so too. Yeah. So one of the ways I would maybe unpack that really practically is when I've been in a hurry, when my soul is in a hurry, I sort of imagine my life and my work as a bunch of things to manage. When I slow down inside, I begin to realize, oh no, my life is people. I get to
Mm.
love, I get to walk alongside. It's a God who is always with me. So hurry tends to like thingify my life and my work. And I don't think that's how Jesus works.
I love that. I think we're going to start using
Thingify it.
thingify. Like, Kyle, I think you're
We're making up
thingifying
words.
everything. It'll be great.
Yeah.
The other part to that always kind of strikes me is just the idea of uh, hurry is usually rooted in worry for us.
Mm.
Very
Yeah.
often is that like we're focused on the thing or the task that we need to be doing, and we are oftentimes worried or hurrying because we're worried that it's not going to get done.
Mhm.
And so there's like this
Yeah.
task orientation, but also this pressure of it's on me. I need to do this. And God is never not ever he's never hurried, but he's also never worried because he's in control. He's never up in heaven wringing his hands like, what's going to happen today?
Yeah.
He's got it under control. And so those two are really, really connected. And being able to remember that is helpful to say, okay, what's the root of my hurry as we're facing these, as we see it coming out in our life, to understand, is it because I'm just task oriented, or is it because there's actually something where I'm trusting in myself instead of God? Or what is the root of that hurry in our life? So,
Yeah. I think that's an important question to ask. And there's more than one answer to what
yeah,
is it that lies underneath my hurry.
yeah.
You highlight how Jesus waited 30 years to begin ministry, then spent 40 days in the wilderness before acting. How should Christ's unhurried beginning to ministry challenge our often accelerated pace to jump into our calling?
Yeah. Well, so one of the things I sometimes say to leaders, and I think I might have written about this in An Unhurried Leader as well, but I think I'll use the word grossly overestimate the impact of our busyness.
Hmm.
We imagine that our frantic activity is the main contributor to kingdom progress. I don't think the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit are as desperate for what I'm doing as I think they are. I think the Father, the Son, and the Spirit are about something remarkable in this world they've made. I think that they have not lost touch with what the needs are around this planet. And I think Jesus in particular has invited us to join him in what he's doing in our little part of the world, the place where he planted us. That will enable you, that vision will enable you to work hard, but from a place of grace and a place of peace, rather than a frantic sense of over responsibility, as though the entire planet will cease to spin on its axis if I don't stay engaged in the thing I'm doing, whatever the thing is.
Hmm. Yeah, that can be really humbling. I know when we were in South Africa, we ran an AIDS ministry. We ran a care
Mm.
home we could take in 4 people at a time that were in end stage HIV. And it was just Kyle and I and the like nurse aides we had trained, and I got mono, and then I had a tumor growing and had to have surgery, and there was all
Ooh.
these things where we were having to shut down the care home, or where I couldn't be there and I was the medical personnel. And it shows you really quickly that God's in control and he will get his ministry done in spite of us. And sometimes he has to remind us of that. And God definitely showed us that he didn't need us. Ministry still happened. We would close the doors of the care home because I would be sick or need surgery or something. And our caregivers would be out in their communities, taking what they were learning in the care home from us and doing it in their communities without us even asking them to. It was just a great reminder that, yeah, God's got this under control, and we don't have to fear or think that we have to hold it all together. That's
Yeah.
definitely, I know, a component in my hurry, in my busyness.
One of the other things you mentioned was describing Jesus's unhurried night in prayer before choosing his disciples. And how has that shaped your own decision making rhythms, especially as you lead? And what would you say to leaders who maybe feel too busy to pause like that?
Yeah. Well, one of the things I think is absolutely genius about Jesus and his way is try to think about this. He has what, 3.5 years of active ministry. I have been in ministry now for coming up on 41. I am confident Jesus gets more done in 3.5 years than I have in 40. And he does it with a remarkably spacious pacing. Like Luke reports maybe better than any of the Gospels how often Jesus withdrew to lonely places to pray. I had a friend who did a study of the Gospel of Luke, and there are multiple, maybe 7 or 8 moments where his withdrawal results in some expansion or some critical decision. So what I want to argue is our withdrawing to pray does not take away from ministry. It enriches ministry. Again, I just think when we are frantically busy doing lots of things out of a spirit of hurry, we think we're getting a lot of kingdom stuff done. But I don't think it tends to last. I think a lot of our activity is about making sure everyone else thinks we're doing what we're supposed to do. Whereas what I want to say is, well, Vincent de Paul, who was a 17th century spiritual writer and head of a community, he said, the one who hurries delays the things of God. Well, that is a very un-American thing to say. But I think it's true. Think of how many biblical stories a human initiative that rushes ahead of God results in a significant delay in what God wished to do. It's almost as though God may have to undo things I do in a hurry. So if you can begin to realize that, you can begin to then realize these practices that open up space to be with God, to notice God, to listen for the voice of God in Scripture, to listen to the guidance of the Spirit. All of this gives me wisdom. It gives me creativity. It gives me a sense of true kingdom purpose. Then I can say the yeses I need to say. I can say the nos I need to say. And I'm more likely to actually be doing the things Jesus would be doing if he were in my role right now.
Yeah. It allows us to be led by him.
Yeah.
And to hear from him in that space, so that our time is invested in the right things, so we can be a part of what he's doing in the world.
Yeah.
You're right that crowds can make us feel successful quickly, but real discipleship takes time. In a culture that values numbers and those reports, how can we stay focused on helping people grow deep with Jesus instead of just growing bigger or growing our numbers?
Yeah, that may be one of the most challenging, I will call it a blind spot in North American understandings of ministry. We just assume, we have this assumption, bigger is always better. And I think you just have to ask the question, is it always? Is it sometimes better? Oh yeah. Sometimes big is wonderful. But there's other kinds of big you may not want. So, for example, with Jesus always treated the crowds with love. He saw them with the eyes of a shepherd, right? The Gospels tell us, like sheep without one. And he always saw them through the eyes of invitation. He longed for them to come follow him, but not for their reasons, for his reasons. The challenge with the crowd is the crowd follows Jesus for their agenda. Disciples learn to follow Jesus for his agenda. And sometimes we're spending an awful lot of time gathering and then trying to keep a crowd in a way that does not necessarily help them pivot to following Jesus for his reasons. That to me is the distinction between what Elton Trueblood, who was a Quaker author from last century, he talked about this dynamic of the crowd and the core. Core was his word for that inner circle that Jesus poured so much time into. He didn't pour time into the core at the expense of the crowd. He didn't ignore the crowd, but he also didn't live for the crowd. He didn't let the crowd define him. He didn't let the crowd decide his agenda. He was there to bless them, to serve them, but ultimately to invite them in to become his students, to learn life from him. So again, I think the great challenge is if we're doing a lot of things to get a crowd interested and then keep a crowd interested, we may be operating on their agenda rather than on Christ's agenda.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that is important to set our agenda that way and to say, well, what is true health? What does God want through this? Not
Yeah.
what brings in the masses. God will bring in the people He wants in the way that He wants.
And that it can at the same time be very enticing though,
Oh,
because the
yeah.
big gets the recognition, gets the applause, and it can
Gets
be
the
hard
funding.
sometimes. Exactly. It can be
That's
hard to
never an issue.
say.
No, it isn't.
I'm
Oh, it is sometimes for me, but I get you.
Sure.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it can be really hard sometimes to admit that you're spending your day in, day out on such a small number, or what might look like such a small
Yeah.
number of people. It's a real heart battle, even in missions, because we
Oh, yeah.
want to, can I say, prove our worth, that we want people to know that we are being good stewards of, finances and time and what God has called us to do. But I
Yes.
think there's a constant battle between, like you just described so wonderfully, going at exactly what God wants us to do and what we actually can build into and what matters to God and what's growing God's work and God's agenda opposed to just performing, so to speak.
Yeah. No, I hear you.
When we were in South Africa, I remember a really pivotal time in our ministry when we were shifting over to work with from the AIDS ministry to doing pastoral training. And that was a big struggle because before that, it was kind of like we were the flagship ministry. We could be able to write home about all these big things, and you're able to show the things you're doing. But shifting to a pastoral training ministry where we only had like 10 or 12 guys it was a lot smaller. So I almost felt there was two parts. That one was feeling like I needed to explain in kind of a teaching way to our churches and donors of like why this was important because
Mm-hmm.
it didn't look as big, so it was different. But for me, just encouraging my heart in that of seeing the long term value was kind of the idea of instead of us being the flagship ministry, it was almost like we were becoming the submarine. And instead of
Mm.
being the flagship, we were able to, as a submarine, support 10 or 12 flagships because these guys were all having their churches and planting churches. So uh, it was just a shift that, hey, we're not going to be front and center on that, but we need to be able to take a lower view on this. But by doing that, we're able to actually support something that's even far greater in the long term.
Yeah. But it strikes me if you took the story of Jesus and you removed the name Jesus from the story and you removed a lot of the context from the story, and then you put that story in front of a North American executive and you ask that executive, is this a success story? I think most of them would say no. And you'd know why they said no, because they've got certain rulers by which they're going to measure the life impact in his lifetime of this leader. Now, what I want to say is you and I are sitting here on a podcast 2,000 years later, having a conversation about the impact of someone who had 3 years of active ministry. So what I want to say is when you follow his way, and it may be that part of that will be pouring deeply into the lives of a few who then go on in their lives to be people of impact and influence. See, I think we imagine that the main way the kingdom is going to grow is by big explosive movements. I just don't think you see that in the first 3 centuries of the church. What you see is this ferment, this relational expansion, this one at a time and one at a time, and just a flow of the life of God from person to person to person. And yes, therefore, it looks big, but how it got big is a fair question. And in the way it got big was because of the strategy of Jesus in the way he invested his time. and where he poured the majority of that time. I just think there's something in that for us, if it really is our hope to have a significant part in what God's doing in God's world. Maybe the way Jesus does things is more strategic than we realize.
Just maybe.
Maybe it's possible.
One of the quotes in the book was from Henry Nouwen, where he said, the interruptions were my work. How has that idea, that quote, changed how you engage with unexpected moments in your day-to-day life and ministry?
Yeah, I think that's super important because again, for example, I am a structure person. I'm a plan person. I love to make a plan for my day, my week, my month, whatever, and then work that plan and make it happen and check the things off and all that. I love that. Except that most of these significant opportunities that have come to me were not on my calendar when that day began. So this is what you have to remember. By all means, one of my mentors, I quote him a lot too. His name was Chuck. He said, plan well and then hold your plans loosely. I just think there's genius in that. Of course we plan. Of course, when you're an organization, you have to think down the road. All of these things are important, but our plans are not the main contributor to the progress of the kingdom in this world. So again, there have been so many moments where I thought I was going to do one thing, and then I got there and I realized, oh, what I planned is not what is needed. What is needed is different. And when you can hold your plans loosely, you can pivot much more easily. You can draw on something else that you could bring to a group. Let's say you're speaking to them or some individual who's crossed your path in great need. I just think, again, Jesus is beautifully genius in the way he is able to speak to the one who crosses his path with such grace and such wisdom. I really want to be able to follow that. And so if I am clinging white knuckle to my plan, it's very hard to, they're all interruptions then. It's just all interruptions, even if the Spirit's bringing it.
Yeah, I think the more that theme has kind of been running through Kyle and I's conversation, the more we're kind of convicted with all the moments in the past we've probably missed, which, gives us hope for the future. But, just wondering how many conversations, how many moments was God setting before me to love somebody, to give that cup of cold water. It's really been on our minds a lot recently as we're just really trying to see ministry in the margins, making sure we have margin in our life and in our schedule for those God interruptions. Because I think when we have those and when we notice those, they're really exciting. We're like, oh my goodness, this conversation that I had that I wasn't even expecting, and I either got to share Christ or got to encourage someone. We love it when we have those. But if we don't build margin into our schedule, or if we're always using that word interruption, because it is kind of a negative tone, it can keep us from seeing all those wonderful things that God is bringing into our day.
One of my Bible school professors used to say, if you hold your hands or uphold your plans with an open hand, it hurts less when they get taken out.
Yeah. Amen.
You use the metaphor of an oak tree to compare our growth in righteousness. Slow growing, deeply rooted, and enduring. What has helped you personally embrace that kind of long view towards spiritual growth? Because I know we all want quick growth.
Yeah. Well, there's a few things that come to mind. One, I love one of Eugene Peterson's books. He titled it after a line from Nietzsche, which is a long obedience in the same direction. That phrase has captured my imagination. I also remember as a young leader when I began to pivot from a very hurried orientation to try and be a little more rooted. Some of the language of John 15 began to become a place of home for me. I'm a branch. Jesus is the vine. If I stay connected, I'll be fruitful. If I'm disconnected through busyness or any number of other reasons to disconnect, I won't be fruitful. It's not a mystery. If you walk into a vineyard here in California where I live, and there's a branch sitting on the ground not connected to the vine, nobody's puzzled why it's withered. Nobody looks at that and goes, well, why did that happen? But in our frantic busyness, we can become detached all the time. So that's been one. There's a line in John 15, verse 16, 1560 maybe. He says, you didn't choose me. I chose you, and I appointed you to go and bear fruit. And then he qualifies. He says, fruit that will last. That little phrase, fruit that will last, that has been just sort of anchored in the back of my mind and the depths of my soul for decades in ministry. I'm always asking myself, how might what I'm doing right now have lasting value, lasting impact? How might what I'm doing with this particular group of people that I happen to be with now in this season or in this moment, how is what I'm saying and how I'm being with them, how might that bear fruit that lasts? I'm not saying I have the magical 10-step, hack for bearing fruit that lasts. But if you live with that and if it becomes your prayer over time, you'll start to see things. You'll start to notice things. So that's been helpful. The other thing is I've come to the conviction that a lot of things that grow fast also die fast. And I've found that things that grow slow have a tendency to become rooted and then last. And so the oak tree metaphor, if you planted an oak tree here in Southern Cal with hopes of shade, you're looking at 20 years at least before you got any kind of shade out of that tree, and probably 30, 40, 50 or more before it was a big, shade producing tree. I just think some of the metaphors God uses in Scripture lend themselves to a more unhurried sort of posture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because those roots, just as much as the tree goes up, it has to grow down under the ground, and that just takes time. It takes a lot of time.
It does.
I'm including an illustration about that in my next book on godly grit. But the idea of how when storms come or when drought comes, before that, you don't really notice which ones have deep roots and which ones have shallow roots. But the droughts and the storms reveal which trees are the ones with the deep roots, because they're able to draw from something so much deeper. And the same thing is true in our life. If we have those deep roots, when hard times come, we're able to endure. We're able to withstand the storms. Another illustration came from the I can't remember the exact term, but the biodome they had down in Arizona years ago.
Oh,
the trees would grow and then they'd fall over. They grew really, really fast, but they didn't have wind. They didn't have, which creates, I think, what was called like stress wood, so they would grow quickly, but because the root system wasn't strong and they didn't have the stress wood, they just like fall over. So fast is not always good. God, for some reason, does seem to grow things that are strong and slow. So that's really interesting.
Yeah.
One of the other things you talk about in the book there is talking about slowness was EPCs, or extended personal communion days, that are not as a time to be productive, but simply just to be present with God. How did that practice emerge in your life? And what would you say to someone who maybe feels they don't have time for something like that?
Yeah. Well, that was one of the great gifts God gave us. Again, in our 20s, in that season of burnout, God brought a few mentors into our lives. And one of them had been a very visibly successful college ministry leader on the East Coast, had a ministry to 600 some students back in the 70s, and he was a star in his neighborhood, like in his world and his movement. And then reading a book by Henry Nouwen, he began to take Mondays off. Not just a day off, but more Sabbath-like,
Yeah.
There's not a day off and a Sabbath are not necessarily the same thing, is what I'm hinting at. And he began to just spend the day with God, praying. Sometimes he'd drive the coast. And at one point he felt God was saying, Wayne, I want you to take a year off and I'd like you to spend it with me. Well, I'm sorry, but how are you going to tell your church board that God said something like that to you. That just sounds like the height of laziness and detachment and unconcern for anything important. But eventually he realized, I'm either going to have to stop listening for God's voice, or I'm going to have to do what I'm pretty sure God's telling me to do. And that beginning of a story resulted in a very different ministry for the rest of his life, which was helping busy leaders like me learn Jesus' rhythm of engagement and disengagement. Again, I quoted that line from Luke 5:16. Jesus often withdrew to lonely places to pray. It began to become clear to me that that might be an invitation to discipleship, that
Mm.
Jesus might be inviting me to follow him and his rhythm. Often withdrew to lonely places to pray. Not rarely, not in emergencies, not here and there, not when he had a quiet season. Often. And in fact, that Luke 5:16 verse comes right after verse 16, which is one of the ones where the crowds keep coming morning till night.
Mm.
So even when he had amazing momentum, like the last thing you want to do is withdraw then, that's exactly when he withdrew. So what I want to say is those rhythms of engagement and disengagement, it's a way of thinking out loud about, what Richard Foster wrote about in A Celebration of Discipline, or what Dallas Willard wrote about in The Spirit of Disciplines. All these spiritual practices, some of them are practices of doing, service and ministry and such, but some of them are practices of not doing or undoing. My experience is Christian leaders, especially in my cultural context, find the disciplines of undoing and not doing the hardest ones to practice because they feel like they are unproductive. I get
Mm.
nothing done. But here's what I would say after 35 years of seeking to set aside at least one day a month to just meet with God. I've never once regretted having set aside that day, even when the week was frantically busy and I knew there were things that would not quite get done to the degree I wanted to get them done if I took that day off like I'd planned months before.
Mm.
But what I can tell you is I can't remember how many times there was a strategic insight that came speaking to a problem I'd been banging my head against for days and weeks. When a creative idea came that I had been brainstorming and wrestling with and wondering about for ages, and then it just came as a gift. In those moments of prayer, in those moments of silence and solitude, whatever the discipline of disengagement is, you receive something you cannot achieve by
Mm.
mere human
Mm-hmm.
effort.
Yeah.
You experience grace. That's why I think the rhythm of Jesus is so genius. He knows exactly what the Father is doing. He knows exactly what the Father is saying. How? Because he's God? No. If that's the reason, then we can't follow him. But if he knows these things because of his intimate friendship with the Father through the Spirit, because he is always listening, then we could learn in our imperfect way to follow Jesus' way in that spirit. So
Mm.
I just want to say, I've sometimes said, for example, in the practice of a weekly Sabbath, I can get more done in 6 days than I can get done in 7. I'm being a little tongue in cheek when I say that, but what I get done in the 6 when I've spent one day to just be with God, enjoy the gifts of God, who I am in the other 6 is completely different than the overwork exhausted me that just works day after day after
Mm.
day after day at about 50% or 40% or even 30%.
Mm.
Yeah, that's so good. That passage in Luke was so instrumental and pivotal for my life years and years ago. I didn't see anyone doing it, but just seeing it, and Jesus, like, all right, if Jesus is doing it, I think it's okay if I do it as well. But just like what you were saying, though, you have to plan for it because
Yeah.
all the other stuff comes up, and if you haven't planned for it, I don't know about you, but I kind of like, well, this came up and this came up. Well, I'll just push it back a little bit. But if it's on the
Yep.
calendar, then it's like, okay, no, I planned for it. I need to do it. I call mine my wilderness time, going
Yeah.
out and getting away. But as I look back, similar to you, as I look back over years, those have been like the most pivotal times where I've become either the most grounded or just have that clarity of thought. My whole book that I'm working on right now came from one day out in the woods with a hammock
Right.
journaling. And it wasn't to write a book. It was just
I
like I
know.
was trying to figure something out. I discovered months later, like, hey, that's actually really, really helpful clarity. And I didn't just come up with it myself. It was just being alone with God and taking the time to do that. That God allows us those windows to what He wants to speak to our soul when we quiet our soul down. We
Yeah.
can hear Him better.
Yeah.
Well,
It's
it just
interesting.
strikes me that if I could just piggyback on that, this is what I mean when I say the best work grows in the soil of good rest.
Mm.
Hmm.
Because, see, we tend to think of rest as coming after work. Work, exhausted, collapse, then put the label rest on that. That's not the biblical idea of rest. Rest, in some ways, though the Sabbath day in creation is day 7, it's really humanity's first full day. And so the Jewish rabbis would say, though it's last in creation, it's first in intention. This is where our lives start. God does not make all of us because he's just desperate for another army of workers. He had an army of workers. They were called angels, messengers, right? He didn't make us mostly to do God jobs. He made us because he wanted his circle of love, Father, Son, and Spirit, to expand. He made us to love us. And then we get to work from that relationship of love instead of working for some crazy sense that now God will love me better. So again, one of the things that happens, you've probably seen this in your experiences, that practice of stepping away is where I remember I'm loved not because of what I do, but just because of who I am. And then I bring that security back to my work. If I'm working desperate for something from the people I serve, I'm not doing very good work.
Hmm.
That's very true.
It's really interesting what you said there at the first. Could you say that again about the soil?
Yeah, so I think of rest as soil in which good work grows.
Hmm.
So that's an order issue. Rest in that vision precedes work instead of follows work.
Yeah.
In the Jewish mind, that's how it works. You know, a day is sunset to sunset, which is to say, it begins with half a day of rest, followed by a half a day of work. Now, that's not to say that most of the Jewish history they understood that or followed it, but it was at least in their theory, and
Yeah.
at least some of their rabbis understood that distinction. Eugene Peterson makes much of that in a couple of his pastoral books. So that has been really important for me, that my good work grows best in the soil of good rest. And by rest, I don't just mean, getting enough sleep every night. I'm talking about the
Hmm.
kind of rest Jesus speaks of in Matthew 11, rest for your soul. Am I
Hmm.
working from a place of peace, of well-being, of abundance, of my cup overflows? Is that the place my work is coming from? Or is my work coming from a mostly empty, pour out my last couple of drops of what I've got in me kind of place? It probably doesn't need to be said that the quality of work is radically different between those two visions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's interesting as think of soil as like a farming soil. It needs to you actually need to let that soil rest and recover so that it can produce fruit. And so that's would also be the resting before we produce fruit. We need to have
That's
that
right.
time to be able to replenish so that the fruit can grow well.
I
Yes.
find it interesting that it's actually so hard to do, though, in practice, that it's so frowned upon, that idea of spending solid away time with God. Because, it would be totally normal if we said, oh, I'm going to go hang out with my mentor for a day, or I'm going to go back to a professor that I really respected
Mhm.
and learn from that person. Like, that would be applauded. But the
Mhm.
idea that we struggle to go to the God of the universe who created us, who can give us
Yeah, who has
everything that
time
we
for
need to
that, I
do the
guess.
work. Exactly. I'm being a little convicted about our priorities right now, and like kind of the way
Oh,
we would order that, because yeah, in other circumstances we would definitely be like, wow, that's a really smart thing to do.
Doesn't feel productive.
Yeah, but to go and spend a solid day with the God of the universe, and then to think we're not getting anything done, that's very convicting.
Well, and so that, to be fair, there are those, and I think maybe before we hit record on this conversation, you were talking about this. There are some who, in the name of spiritual formation, have grown very lazy,
Mm.
and they're not very involved in the work of ministry they've been entrusted with. So there are some people who use spiritual practices and solitude and silence and some of these other disciplines as an excuse for their own sloth, their own laziness. That does happen. So you have to acknowledge that. You have to admit that sometimes that happens. Sometimes it happens because people are so exhausted, they pendulum swing to just a place of desperate need for rest. So you also have to have a little compassion on at least some of those. But what I want to say is that that resting in that spirit is a God-given invitation. That Jesus gives us the gift of good work. Yeah, we get to collaborate. That's what his yoke is. It's an instrument of labor. I think when Jesus says, take my yoke, he's not like holding this big beam of wood and then tosses it over to me and it lands in my arms and gonk. Now I've got this work. I'm carrying my yoke. I think it's a picture of Jesus is in the yoke. There's an empty spot next to him. He's saying, come, take my yoke. Join me in what I do. If you join him in what he does, you have to do it at his pace.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Absolutely.
when they would train a young animal, they'd put it with a seasoned animal, and that young animal would be running ahead and dragging behind and trying to run off to the left or to the right, depending on its position. And the seasoned animal would just do what it does, do what it knew. Jesus isn't a mature animal, but Jesus is the solid one. Jesus is the one who knows what he's doing and where he's going. And when we take his yoke, we need to take his pace. And his is a more unhurried pace than the average North American.
And as we do, he's the one that pulls the weight. We just have to keep pace with him is all we have to do.
That's right.
Or not lag behind or push ahead. And then it is easy because he's the one pulling the weight. That's such a beautiful picture.
Nice.
You ask whether we see prayer as real work, especially for those in leadership. How do you encourage leaders to treat prayer not as an add-on, but as a central part of the calling, the central work?
Yeah. Well, I think maybe one of the ways I've sometimes answered this question is Paul the Apostle. Is he a leader or is he a prayer? And the answer to that question is you can't say either or. He's both. He's a remarkable leader and he's a remarkable person of prayer. He manages to be both. I think great leaders over the centuries have always been both. The driven, frantic, get a lot done leaders from 500 years ago, you don't even know their names. Nor do you know the names of very many of the people who just hid in their little closet and all they did was pray and never, ever, ever stepped into the world to join Jesus in what he was doing. The stories you know, the ones we admire, are the ones of people who were deeply rooted in prayer and profoundly engaged in the world in which God had planted them. There was an integration. So it's not pray or work, pray or lead, pray or minister. It's not even pray then lead or then minister. Like there's this sequence. Okay, I go and I get topped off, in the presence of God. And then I close that door and I run off into my ministry. And somewhere about halfway through the day, I run out of gas and then I'm just running on fumes. No, it's pray and lead. Prayer is the beating heart of kingdom leadership. One of my mentors used to love this image of a pitcher and a cup. So a cup, imagine Psalm 23, my cup overflows. The pitcher is just there to say, God's always pouring. So the pitcher is pouring into the cup. Well, he would say a lot of us run around doing ministry just holding the cup. And then we pour, a little here and a little there and a little here and a little there. And pretty soon our cup's empty. No big surprise. What if instead you left the cup upright and God was just always pouring and you stayed in the place God was pouring? Well, now everything you do is an expression of overflow. You're not given the last 3 drops of what you have. You're given the extra you can't even hold. So when Jesus says, I came to that they might have life and that more abundantly, he wanted us to be thriving and flourishing as leaders. He wanted us to know the depths and the width and the length and the height and all that of God's remarkable love for us, so that we could announce this gospel to a world desperate for love like that. So I want my life to be gospeled so that I can then proclaim a gospel. I want to keep believing in this good news that I've been given and I've been living in for so many years.
That's really good. We definitely need to continue to prioritize that and see that prayer is that foundation of everything we do. We may accomplish a lot of things on our to-do list, but the real question is, are we really accomplishing anything that's going to be of kingdom value in 500 years, as you were talking about?
Yeah.
And that's only when we stay connected to the vine and stay connected to him, that he's filling us to the point of overflowing.
Yeah.
Well, before we close, is there anything else you'd like to leave our listeners as one final encouragement or invitation of those that are wanting and longing to live a more unhurried, deeply rooted life in Jesus?
Well, one thing I would want to say is start exactly where you are. I remember I was sitting in a coaching appointment and I was talking with a young leader and he was just frantically busy. I could just see on his face how exhausted he was and how anxious he was about everything he'd said yes to and everything he'd planned to be involved in. And we were having a conversation like this. And I just remember I ended up saying to him a sentence, something like this. I said, you know where would be the perfect place to start this journey of being unhurried for you? You know where the perfect place would be? Exactly where you are right now. That would be the perfect place to say, Jesus, I would like to learn from you how to follow your unhurried way. What do you recommend now to me as your student? What would be one little next step I could take? Make it a matter of prayer. And then I like to say, start as small as you possibly can, like planting a seed. A lot of times we think even spiritual initiatives have to start big and explosive and wow, and we have to write a blog post about it, and we have to preach a sermon about it, or at least have an illustration about it in our sermon. Do it invisibly. Tell a mentor, yeah. Tell a small circle of encouragers, yeah, of course. But plant something small in your life and then just keep watering it. It's the persistence, it's the regularity that will produce something new. And then see what that grows into. For me, this unhurried journey has been about 35 years of my adult life. I really like what it's grown into. I'm very grateful for some of the things I get to do now that most people will never know about. But I have a feeling that many of them are the sorts of things that are on the heart of Jesus for our times and for where God's put me and the opportunities God's opening to me. I'm very glad for the journey I'm on. My next birthday will be my Medicare birthday, 65. And
Congratulations.
Thank you. I tell you what, I don't know if I've ever enjoyed what I'm doing more than I do right now. And I'm not sure I've ever felt it was as fruitful in a way that matters as it feels right now. So I would just say to your listeners, start right where you're at, start small, be persistent, and see what grows.
Do you have a few suggestions as to some of those small things? If someone's just looking at their schedule, looking at their crazy pace of life, and it's maybe like, I don't know, I need an idea. What do you see some people doing as some small baby steps?
Yeah. Well, so the smallest one I sometimes will say to new clients I'm coaching, I'll urge them, maybe not once a day, but occasionally, to take 5 minutes and do nothing. Now, I don't say it because I think they're going to feel all happy and cozy and comfy. I do it because I want them to feel how frantically hurried they are on the inside. It's diagnostic, not therapeutic. And so even just taking 5 minutes and just noticing the quality of hurry in your soul, and then asking yourself, is that helping me? Is that helping anyone else? So that's more of a diagnostic thing. The other thing I would say is, I think the rhythm of a Sabbath, if you can't set aside an entire day every week, you just can't see your way clear to that season of life or whatever it is, set aside some amount of time where instead of it being a have to window of time, it's a get to or a
Mm.
don't have to window of time. I was speaking to a group of pastors, and one of them said, he's young dad and little kids, and I can't imagine what a Sabbath would look like for me right now. So I just said, well, what if you had a day where there were no have tos and you just did something you like to do with your kids? What would you do? His face lit up. So it might be that what you need to do is just ask yourself, or ask God even, what would you like to do together if I were to take a part of a day to be Sabbath-like? What would you
Mm.
like to do together? How would you like to spend some of that time? And see what comes to mind. It might look like something you already like to do, but you keep saying, I don't have time for it. You might find God does. So those are a few thoughts that come to mind.
Yeah, thanks for those.
That's really good. Well, Alan, thank you so much for taking the time today just to share from your heart and the things that God's been working in you. And I pray and hope that this will be an encouragement and a blessing. I'm sure it will to others as they start that or continue that journey of an unhurried life with the Lord. As you talked about taking that first step, that proverb or quote of, a journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. And so I think
Mm-hmm.
that's a great encouragement to people just to say, what's the first step they can take, and take that step today to be able to begin to slow down and allow God to fill us and overflow from us and to work through us as an unhurried life. So thank you so much for your time today.
So it was great to be with both of you, Kyle and Heather. Thank you.
Well, that's all for this show, and we want to thank you again for spending your valuable time with us today.
If you enjoyed this episode, please consider taking just a moment and giving us a great review. Your review will help people find the podcast and allow these resources to encourage more people. If you took something valuable away from this episode, please share it with someone who would enjoy it.
If you'd like to find the show notes, blog posts, and free resources for ministry and leadership, as well as some information on my book, Overflowing, visit kylefarran.com. That's KYLEFARRAN.com. Hope to see you soon on a future podcast.